We're here to talk about privacy, a very important topic for all people, not just Bitcoiners. Let's start with an introduction. You guys want to introduce yourselves?
Sure. My name is Poelstra. I've been working in the Bitcoin space since 2011, or I guess more formally since 2013, focused mainly on developing privacy technologies, in particular focusing on privacy technologies that don't incur massive scaling costs. So I was one of the developers of a zero-knowledge proof scheme called Bulletproofs, which supports a form of privacy technology called confidential transactions, which hides amount in Bitcoin transactions.
Hi, I'm Isabela. I'm the executive director of the Tor project. Tor allows you to browse the internet anonymously. It's one of the, I would say, the best privacy enhancing technologies out there. Not only allows you to browse the internet, but also offers servers in an anonymous way that also preserve privacy and also helps you with bypassing censorship.
I'm Leo. I'm part of a group of people who started the Bitcoin meetup in 2012, which we now call ourselves the Bitcoin Association. It's still an industry group, a community. I got actually into Bitcoin through privacy and through my passion for information security. It was very much for me in the beginning like a tool to achieve online privacy.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. My name is Odell. I'm just a Bitcoiner who likes privacy, who cares about privacy. So let's start off. I think the important thing to get out of the gate is why is privacy important? Isabella, you want to start for us?
Sure. I think in general the world is learning more and more why privacy is important. That has been the internet industry created a revenue model that explored a lot of learning people's behavior, and on the top of that, there has been created other surveillance methodologies and mechanisms. So the more and more you learn about how the business model and the surveillance mechanism works with all the scandals that comes out, you are looking for a privacy solution. So I would say that today, the common person anywhere in the world, in a democracy or not, are looking for privacy, but I feel that there are very extreme cases where one who lives in the United States might not think about that people do need privacy. There are countries where, for instance, LGBTQ communities is illegal to be gay, so if you need privacy to just exist and be yourself. In political dissent also, there's more and more technology of surveillance become cheaper, so you don't need to be a big state apparatus to get that. You can buy that technology with $1,000 and you can just use that against people. So it's increasing more and more the use case. But I would say that today, with more of the scandals that came out recently on how people are exploring your behavior online for different things, that every person is looking for a way or another for solutions for privacy. I feel what is missing is to understand what is the type of solution you need, and you to differentiate and find that. And that is a technical curve that people are going through still.
Yeah, so on one hand, privacy protects us from our governments and protects us from oppression. But I believe that everybody in the world is going to very soon more and more feel a need for online privacy, especially because otherwise they're going to get completely ripped off with their day-to-day commerce. The reason why Facebook and Google are trying to learn so much about you is not because they want to politically oppress you. They simply want to get the most out of every single transaction that you make. So when you buy a coffee at a coffee shop, that coffee might be worth a lot more to you than what you paid. And that difference between what you would be willing to have paid and what you actually paid is sort of the surplus you get out of that transaction. Now, Google and Facebook want to, in every single transaction, know exactly how much you're getting out of it. They want to exactly know how much this plane ticket, this travel, this computer, this massage is worth to you, so that they can charge you as close to that as possible. So for you to have online privacy, and I think that's what makes it very relevant in the financial case of us having online privacy as we're transacting, as we're making payments, is going to be incredibly important to us to simply get a good deal online.
Right. To add, I'm going to elaborate a bit on what Leo said there. Basically, as we transition to a more globally connected, more internet-focused society, This has necessarily resulted in a transition away from cash and cash-like instruments that we can carry around into online forms of payment. And without technologies such as cryptocurrencies and without private cryptocurrencies, the result of that transition is not only from something physical to something online, but it's away from a bearer instrument where you hold something, you can transfer it, there are no third parties involved, to an intermediated form of financial transactions. Meaning when you use a credit card, that transaction goes through your bank. When you use PayPal or something, that goes through PayPal or Venmo or Huawei, and then Google, Apple Pay, Facebook. And what we've seen is that historically, when people talk about privacy and they talk about surveillance in these kind of forms, traditionally what we focused on is government oversight and government surveillance. And this is an important discussion to have, but it's a discussion that we are having, and at least in the United States, we have a lot of legal infrastructure and precedent for this. What we don't have is legal precedent and laws restricting the kind of oversight done by companies such as Facebook, who just launched a very anti-private cryptocurrency, companies like PayPal, companies like Venmo, and so forth, or even credit card companies and other payment processors. And these companies have a tremendous amount of visibility into every single transaction that every single person in this room and our friends and families are doing. And as Leo said, they can use this for nefarious economic purposes. We see in some parts of the world they're using it for nefarious political purposes. So for example, the two largest payment processors in China have now insight into something like over 90% of all transactions happening in China. And that data, because these companies, I think it was Huawei and I forget the other one, because they are so intertwined with the Chinese government, who's attempting to institute this social credit system, the result is that for an individual attempting to interact with their friends and family and their community, now all of those transactions are visible to their government, which is going to use it potentially, and well, who has used it, to restrict people's ability to interact further, their ability to travel, and their ability to live in an autonomous way.
Thank you, guys. I especially liked how you discussed how these governments could then use that information to control their populace, basically stop dissent, protests. We saw in Hong Kong with the protests, they didn't want to use, none of the protesters wanted to use the octopus card because they didn't want to be tracked to the protests and be on file, basically.
They fear that simply their profile fitting a student aged between 17 and 25, wearing a black t-shirt, and having used their public transportation card to get to the area of the protest might already be enough for the government to target them. Mm-hmm. And so by limiting the amount of information the government can, for example, present in court, and Hong Kong still does have like a functioning legal system, they expect to protect themselves. And it's like a very obvious and easy to understand example of why you want financial privacy, simply as part of voicing your political opinions.
Right, so using Bitcoin privately you don't have to just worry about using Bitcoin the right way. You also have all this other metadata and outside data that you need to keep secure at the same time. For instance, if you send someone a text message with a Bitcoin address in it, like it doesn't matter how you're using the underlying protocol if that address is then filed away like in a government record somewhere, or by your phone agencies. So one of the things that is really important here is Tor usage, which is why I'm really happy that we got you here as well. Tor and Bitcoin are very intertwined. To use Bitcoin privately, you very much need to rely on Tor, and it has very similar trade-offs in terms of prioritizing censorship resistance and prioritizing privacy. Could you go into some detail about how to handle those trade-offs and how to?
Yes, so the Tor network is a decentralized network. So we have around 6,000 to 8,000 servers all around the world run by volunteers. And when you want to access something on the internet, you bounce through 3 of those servers, and each connection has a layer of encryption. And then you go out from the network to the normal internet and access the website. But we also have something that is called onion servers, which is the same way I can access a website through bouncing through those 3 relays. I can also offer something that bounces those through 3 relays of the network, and you meet inside of the network. So you never get out of the network that way. And I like to say that like this type of technology, on my perspective, is kind of like the foundation for you to build solutions on the top of it. And one of the good things that this brings is that when you do establish a connection inside of the network, you're not only having end-to-end encryption, but because everything is inside of the network, bouncing to 3 servers each side, and all that with layers of encryptions, you have the ability, depending on the solution you're creating on the top of it, of either not having a metadata whatsoever, because there are solutions like that, or the metadata will be completely obfuscated, covered up, right? Like so nobody would be watching it. I can give an example, like when you're using chat clients on your phone, you're using Signal, for instance, it's encrypting the content but not the metadata. So someone watching the wire could like easily collect the metadata and build a whole behavioral map of what you're doing. And that goes for transactions as well, right? So I would say that like it's very important if you are you want to build a solution that enhances privacy, to think about metadata, not only the content, because of the power of metadata, right, or mapping behavior. So I would say that for you could have your wallet having a client of Tor that can connect to our onion servers of like someone who is offering, selling something or whatever, and then you can make those transactions inside of the network and make those payments inside of the network. And today it's super easy to do so. This year we released a new release of Tor that is smaller and much better, like completely focused on making it more optimal for mobile use cases. So it could be easily like embed inside of a wallet without increasing the package and all that kind of stuff. So I would say that by default, the way Tor works and what we provide, our technology can be the foundation for others to build solutions that are focused on privacy on that level, also obfuscating metadata. And you get, I would say almost for free, one like best anti-censorship circumvention solutions, because we also focus a lot on that. We don't like by using Tor by default, depending on the case of the censorship, because you're bouncing around the world, you might bypass some censorship that focus for the IP addresses of your country. But there are other types of censorship of package inspections, for instance, that you need better circumvention solutions for it. And we have a full team dedicated just to focus on that, where we are trying to build more and more solutions that is expensive for the censor, but cheaper for us to have. So then you get that too as a bonus on the top of it.
And I think these solutions really have to come by default. I really think these solutions have to, we have to build and networks, we have to build an infrastructure that kind of relies on the existence of the Tor network to function. Our fear is that countries like China, which do effectively block Tor, which do effectively block VPNs, which do cause, which monitor every single byte that goes in and out of the Great Firewall of China, that they are going to quite successfully export their infrastructure and their technology to authoritarian countries. And the only thing that can convince these authoritarian countries to not apply these tools and to not censor transactions in that regard is if it breaks their economy. That's the only thing that they care about. Breaking how their transportation, how their state-owned companies, how the international conglomerations work in those countries is the only thing that will kind of prevent them from not censoring these types of networks.
And I'd like to elaborate a bit on how this distinction between data and metadata applies to the Bitcoin network and why the relationship between the Bitcoin network and the Tor network is so important, which is that in Bitcoin, basically all of the real data, all the meaningful data to individuals is metadata. So recently there's been a lot of discussion in the Bitcoin space about adding peer-to-peer encryption to the peer-to-peer protocol. And this might surprise people familiar with the ethos of the Bitcoin project that this would be something that's even under discussion. Why wasn't this done many years ago? Why isn't this the biggest priority? And so on. And the reason is that almost all of the data transferred between nodes on the Bitcoin network is actually public. There's no encryption in the Bitcoin protocol itself. All the transactions are completely public data that go into the public blockchain, and the idea is anybody can download and verify this data. So there's kind of a question to be asked when people suggest adding encryption to the peer-to-peer protocol is why are we encrypting this data if it's public anyway? And the answer is that the flow of this data provides a lot of very important information to people attempting to surveil the network. For example, if somebody is running a wallet software and they create a transaction, ignoring all the difficulties in them learning an address and figuring out where to send the coins and all that good stuff, somebody creates a transaction, they publish it from their wallet or from a node connected to their wallet, and then that node will propagate throughout the entire network. It goes to all of the nodes connected to the wallet, all the nodes connected to those nodes, all the nodes connected to those nodes, so on, in what's called a flood network, and eventually they're picked up by miners and included in blocks. And what you can do as somebody attempting to determine the source of transactions is start up a large number of nodes, or you can do even worse, you can set up just fake nodes that pretend to be nodes, connect to an enormous amount of nodes in the network, and you can actually watch by looking at timing of transactions moving around the network. You can determine pretty accurately where transactions are coming from, and in doing so, you can localize the source of the transaction by IP address, by region, by part of the network. You can get timing analysis, and you can associate that with other information you might have. For example, if you're like a company like Chainalysis, who has data from exchanges about their users' behavior that isn't public, then you can correlate that with what you're seeing on the blockchain. So a lot of the privacy development in the Bitcoin world has been about improving the network privacy of Bitcoin. Undermining the ability for people to simply connect to a lot of nodes and get a very accurate picture of the flow of transactions and the source of transactions. And that's exactly the problem that the Tor network is designed to solve. So that's where Tor comes in on the Bitcoin network.
Yeah. Do configure your Bitcoin node on with the Tor proxy. It's relatively easy to set up. You can use it with Electrum too. One of the easiest things you can do tonight to improve your financial privacy.
We do have a network house system, so we are watching, and if someone tried to dump a lot of nodes in the network, we will not count them as part of the network to avoid that type of correlation analysis. Yeah.
Excellent.
If someone spun up a lot of Tor nodes.
Yeah, we do. Our network team do have people who are observing for the health of the network, right? So the way it works is not like you don't start running a relay and your relay automatically is counted as part of the network. We have what we consider like the consensus of what is the map of the network today. So every hour, as a matter of fact. So we have like a set of what we call it the directories authorities, where a group of servers that look around, check that picture, and then they exchange information and they build the consensus of what they consider the network. And only what they consider as part of the network will be the servers that will be selected to build the secret, which are those 3 relays that I was talking about. So on that process, we are, when you start running a relay on the network, you go to a life cycle of that relay. So you're not right away automatically counted. You have to create reputation, and eventually you start to be counted. So in this process, we are always watching, and when we see bad relays or malicious behavior or a lot of relays coming together at once, things that look suspicious, we flag them right away to not be counted as part of that consensus.
Yeah, very curious if such authorities are eventually going to rise in Bitcoin as well. I don't necessarily think they're necessary. I also don't know if they're that good of an idea in the Bitcoin network as they are in Tor. But it is theoretically possible to subscribe to a service that helps you blacklist on your own node nodes that this authoritarian service considers malicious. But yeah, lots of fuzzy, difficult stuff in there.
Yeah, it's hard.
Right, and one big difference between the way Tor works and the way Bitcoin works is unlike in Tor, where your connections are all peer-to-peer connections, and when you're connected to the network, you have a path from node to node to node. In Bitcoin, most of the data is just being flooded, and so even identifying misbehavior becomes a lot more difficult, and it requires a lot more heuristics, aside from someone, for example, just like spamming invalid transactions or something like that. But that's easy to detect. That's not the kind of problem that we're trying to solve when we're worried about network level attackers.
Yeah. Much more harder for Bitcoin is that we are kind of tricked or forced into giving up our privacy every time we make a transaction, every time we withdraw money from an exchange, every time we look up an address on a block explorer that has some trackers in it. I think those are probably like the most difficult to mitigate threats in the Bitcoin network. When we think about mass surveillance on our transaction, that's incredibly interesting from like an academic perspective. But already the privacy gain you get from simply using Bitcoin over your credit card is like so incredibly massive that we might even say, yeah, these are like now like academic interests in improving that further. But most of us then completely give up again our name, our shipping information, our email address when we kind of submit buy in Shopify or wherever we might be paying with Bitcoin. And I think that's where a lot of the more difficult and dangerous threats come from. And that we actually, at least maybe one of you has a better answer to that. BTC Pay server is certainly like a lot more privacy friendly in that it doesn't centralize your data anywhere. But we do see people being drawn to these services like Shopify because they're much more easier to use, that will eventually do that again, or will eventually at least open up the possibility for people to simply get like a long list of addresses from people who bought a certain thing.
Well, I think you did a very good job like elaborating a lot of the difficulties here. One advantage Bitcoin has in principle over Tor is that because we're routing payments of money, there's maybe some ways to incentivize operators to actually be routing payments correctly. It's difficult to pay for individual transactions to be routed. You need very tiny payments, like much less than a single penny. There's a potential for things like the Lightning Network on Bitcoin to make that usable. And so that has the potential to solve the technological problem of creating a network that people can use to route payments that is robust and quick enough that users could actually use it. And then the second problem there, of course, is the user experience. When somebody installed an app to use Bitcoin, they shouldn't need to know, they shouldn't need to think about whether their payments are being sent to some central server that is then dispatching it somewhere and tracking all of the metadata associated with it, or whether their wallet is able to connect to some sort of peer-to-peer layer and effectively route the payment for them and deal with all of the hidden costs associated with that behind the scenes. So there's both a technological challenge here, and that's something that the Bitcoin community is addressing and has done a very good job addressing over the last several years. And there's also a user experience problem, which in some ways may prove to be even more difficult, and that's also being worked on as well. But it's not an easy problem.
And Bitcoin as a bearer asset is, I think, a lot more dangerous to hold than any other kind of assets. I think generally we know from wealthy individuals and corporations that they prefer not to hold bearer assets. They prefer to put their wealth into stock or into real estate because they can't easily be taken from them. Bitcoin can be very easily be taken from all of us. And I think that makes the topic so dangerous because simply the fact of somebody knowing that you have a Bitcoin might put you in danger, when the fact that somebody knowing that you own an apartment which might be worth like 10 times as much as a Bitcoin or 100 times as much as worth a Bitcoin does not put you into as much danger because it can't simply be taken from you as you like board an airplane.
I just want to say, like, I don't think, I know there is difference on the way Bitcoin, the blockchain and everything works and the way Tor works. I don't feel that Tor would substitute one or one would substitute the other, but I do believe that talking about centralization of information, right? Like if you are going to pursue a way to do your transactions and you want strong privacy, I would definitely recommend that you do not use VPN, and like Tor would be a better solution for you on that front because of the centralization. Like the VPN is very centralized, and who controls that can still see what you're doing, and it depends on the solution. Also, you don't know exactly if they are encrypting or not, because if it's not open source, you cannot validate what they're doing. You don't know what's happening there, right? Like it's like a black box that you're just trusting that person. So I would still suggest that. I would suggest that like maybe you should try to use the Tor network and for the privacy point of if you are doing transactions with Bitcoin. And to something that you said earlier, another use case of Tor, and people use that a lot, is because of that, your exit node is a different IP address of where you live, and you get better deals for flights just by doing that. you get better deals on Amazon as well just by doing that. So that's like a whole consumer area of like why you should use Tor for it.
So let's talk, well, we have a little bit of time left. Let's talk about the criminal turning privacy into illegal, making it illegal, right? Tor has this issue where if you run Tor nodes in certain jurisdictions, especially exit nodes, you can be held liable for those nodes. It can be considered a criminal act just to begin with. How does Tor handle that?
Yeah.
And how does I can see that coming back to Bitcoin, where in a lot of places it could presumably be illegal to run a Bitcoin node.
Yeah. So the criminalization of privacy is very sad, and I feel like one of the things that I like to say very out and loud is that there is no dark web, there is a myth, there is something that the media creates, and if you try to look on the definition of that, it's kind of like everybody has a different type of way of explaining it. Everything that we do is like just a technology that enables privacy and provides that solution for people. So I would say that, to the criminalization of exit nodes, we have a community team where we help the people who run those, and we have a set of like guidance and best practice for that. Like we ask people to not run an exit node for their home, for instance. We do have research on ISPs, if you put it on a data center. So there are like several steps that you can take in order to prevent that something bad happens to you. But there are cases that people who have run exit nodes, there are cases like in Russia, for instance, where people have been framed and put it on jail because of it. So we try to give people some of the measurements that they can take before take this decision, so it can be safe for them to run, and it can be safe for them to run in a way that the traffic is not it's not from you. It's just like any other ISP, kind of from the legal point of view.
Thank you.
Cool.
Sorry.
We have a question from the audience about perceptions of privacy and how do we break away from this idea that, if you're trying to be private in your financial transactions, you must be a criminal. If you have something to hide, that's the only reason you'd want to use this. How do we break away from that and teach people about the importance of privacy?
So this maybe goes back to my comments at the beginning of this panel about how as we move away from brick and mortar transactions to internet level transactions, a transition we're making that maybe a lot of people in society don't recognize is that we're moving away from bearer assets to intermediated assets where every transaction is being surveilled. And there's not really any historical precedent for this kind of surveillance over every single economic transaction that's ever occurred. And this is very destructive to the ideal of a free society, and in practice, the implementation of a free society. If you have a few actors who are able to watch everyone else's economic activity, they can learn a tremendous amount about what people are doing, what they want to be doing, where they are, where they're trying to go, what they're trying to do. So a simple analogy to the level of surveillance that's happening is that most ordinary people, despite not thinking too much about their financial privacy, because historically they haven't had to, nonetheless have blinds on their windows, for example. And if you suggested that they shouldn't have blinds on their windows, their bedroom lights should be on all night, something like that, they should be willing to do that because after all, they have nothing to hide, they'd say, wow, that's a historically unprecedented encroachment of my personal privacy and my autonomy. And it's important to recognize that financial privacy is in the same category.
In Bitcoin, we have the unique opportunity to make both inside of Bitcoin privacy cheaper, to a private transaction to be cheaper than a general transaction through things like Schnorr and CoinJoin. And with Bitcoin, we have the unique opportunity to make transactions online with Bitcoin, meaning in a more private way, to be cheaper than using credit cards or using wire transfers. So I'm quite confident that we can solve this simply by making privacy the cheaper default, that then you no longer need to defend for being private, but you simply use it because that's the cheapest way for you to transact.
Well, thank you all so much.